Hi, everybody. It's me, Randy Ray, at The Literate Texan. Welcome to Driftwood Ranch. I am doing my October reading wrap-up, where I list all the books that I read in October in order of how much I liked them. And October was a really big reading month for me, so this wrap-up is going to take a little time because I was in the hospital for the entire month of October and didn't have much to do there other than read. 2 of those 4 weeks that I spent in the hospital, I was actually in a rehab facility where I was doing about 3 hours of exercise every day, physical therapy, occupational therapy. I even got some mental therapy. You can be the judge of whether that helped me or not. But so I read 16 books total in October, 17 if you count The Great Gatsby twice, because I did read The Great Gatsby twice. The Great Gatsby is one of my favorite books. I try to reread it every year. So far, it's gotten better every single time I've read it, including this last month. I read it, loved it so much that I read it again the next day. So, and why don't we start there? The Great Gatsby. That was the first one I read. This is probably as qualified a candidate for the great American novel as anything you've ever seen. And I'm going to show it off here in a second. Why is this machine making noise? It shouldn't do that, but it did. So The Great Gatsby was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And the cover art looks like this. And I understand from another book that I read recently that this cover art of those eyes is actually a big painting. And I'll tell you more about that book that I read about that in it later. But it's incredibly elaborate. You know, on the cover art, you can see all the lights here at the bottom, you know, but those are actually really intricately detailed and are in different shapes. And I want to say, you know, she said there were telephones in there and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, in brief, you know, spoiler alert. Of course, Great Gatsby's now 100 years old, but it's the story of a guy named Nick who gets a little house, and it's next to a really big house, Gatsby's mansion. Jay Gatsby is sort of the main character in the book, and he is, of course, in love with Daisy Buchanan, but he hasn't seen her in 5 years. He wanted to go out and make a fortune before he saw her again because she's old money and he's new money. But yeah, he was broke when he was dating her, but didn't quite tell her. So his plan was to go get rich, and he succeeded at getting rich. It was the Roaring 20s after all. And so his big plan was to start throwing all these parties in this beautiful mansion across the bay from where she lives, hoping that she'll stumble into one of his parties one day. And she never does. So it turns out she just happens to be Nick's cousin. Nick is the next door neighbor that I mentioned earlier. And so anyway, he convinces Nick to invite her over for tea one afternoon so that Gatsby can just show up and they can be reunited. But it's one of the most intricately patterned and designed novels. There's symbolism all over the place. Some of it intentional, I'm absolutely sure. Some of it unintentional, I'm also absolutely sure. And there's all kinds of themes and stuff running through it. One of the things that I noticed on this latest reread is that there's not a page go by in this book that he does not go into detail about the color of something. You know, the colors really matter a lot to him in this book. Anyway, if you've never read The Great Gatsby, it is the gift that keeps on giving. I can't imagine not liking it. Definitely give it a read, The Great Gatsby. That's my biggest recommendation, okay? So yeah, I gave that, 5 stars out of 5. So, ranked and rated, baby. That's what I promised you, and that's what I'm doing. That was number 1, The Great Gatsby. Number 2 on my list, okay, and we're going from high literature to low so fast now that it's like you could get whiplash. Last month was October, which of course means Halloween, which of course means I've got to read at least one horror novel. And in my mind, to my way of thinking, the greatest horror novel that Stephen King ever wrote was Salem's Lot, and is. And I don't think he's going to top it in terms of horror novels. Now, I think 11/22/63 is arguably a better book, but 11/22/63 I would not categorize as a horror novel. It's a time travel novel, speculative fiction, whatever. Anyway, this is the cover art for this particular edition that I read. I read it on my Kindle. Obviously, you know, I was in the hospital all month. and I needed a way to transport a lot of books in one place. I used the Kindle for that. Salem's Lot, if you know nothing about it, and it's certainly not 100 years old, but it's a good 50 years old. Salem's Lot is the story of a town named Jerusalem's Lot in Maine that a vampire has bought a house there and is moving there. It's basically a retelling of Dracula, but instead of moving to London, he's moving to this town in Maine called Salem's Lot, and the main character is a writer who had an experience in said house. But it's a wonderful book. There's a wonderful character in the book named Father Callahan, who I understand makes multiple appearances, and maybe I'm wrong about that. He might only make a single appearance, but he makes appearances in the Dark Tower series, which is, Stephen King's really big, ambitious product. I mean, it's his Middle Earth, so to speak. Y'all forgive me. I'm on a bunch of medications that make my mouth really dry, so I am going to be sipping on something to drink. Also, it's really important to stay hydrated for various reasons. I also read a book called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. Okay, this was another of my 5-star reads this month. This one was written by Atul Gawande. I don't have a copy of it to show you because I borrowed it with my Kindle Unlimited subscription and I've already returned it. So, but the cover wasn't particularly impressive anyway. It's gray text on a white background. But Being Mortal is all about the choices that doctors make in terms of treating the elderly and the people who are close to dying. Normally, and I love Atul Gawande's books. I think I've read all of them now, but I love his books about medicine. They're all true stories, and they're full of little true stories and witticisms and stuff. But this one in particular is really, really good because I can relate to it in ways now that I couldn't relate to it previously because of my own medical issues that I'm going through and thinking about my family. What am I going to do if and when my condition deteriorates? Because let's face it, I'm never going to be this young again as I am today. And if I live long enough, my condition will eventually deteriorate. And we got to figure out what to do with me. So, but I have daughters and we'll just say right now I'm feeling really good, which is a nice change of pace because for a long time I wasn't. And then James is the other 5-star book in my list. I had 4 books in October that were 5-star books, and James was one of them. James is up for the National Book Award, and I'm reading the 5 finalists for the National Book Award prior to November 20th. I've got 15 days left to finish the other 4 books, but I'm almost finished with all 4s right now. But it was written by Percival Everett. It is sort of a retelling of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but from the perspective of Jim the Slave. And this is a relatively new book. This just came out last year. It's up for the 2024 award. I am not going to divulge any plot spoilers because there are quite a few, but I will say it's wonderfully written. A few years ago, I read a book called Finn, which was written by John Clinch, and it was Adventures of Huckleberry Finn told from the perspective of Huck's dad, his pap. And you might say it must have been a very short book because I will spoil Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. If you haven't read it by now, shame on you. Actually, not shame on you. Actually, you've got something to look forward to. Definitely read the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn if you haven't read it. But Huck's pap, he dies real early in the novel Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So a lot of the stuff that takes place in the novel Finn takes place prior to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It would almost be more accurate to say that it is a prequel to Huckleberry Finn rather than a retelling of it from his pap's perspective. But it's still told from his pap's perspective. And it was really great. I really loved it at the time, but it doesn't hold a candle. I'm going to bring it back around to James. It doesn't hold a candle to James. James is a terrific book. I don't care what it is you hope to get from a book unless you're just outright racist, in which case you're probably not going to pick it up anyway. But no matter what you hope to get from a book, you're probably going to find it in James. It's got just about everything. So anything after this is just a 4-star read or lower, okay? And these aren't in any particular order. Walk on Water, The Miracle of Saving Children's Lives. This was a really interesting book because it was about the doctors and surgeons who operate on children who are born with heart problems. Imagine being a surgeon that specializes in operating on babies who are a day old or a week old, because operating on their tiny little hearts. And imagine what it takes to become really, really good at this. And that's where the title comes from, is Walk on Water, because the surgeons who are really, really good at this, the people who work with them and the parents of the children whose lives they save, literally say that these people walk on water. And it is amazing to think that they have such an incredible success rate, because I can't imagine a patient more vulnerable physically than an infant, that's only a day or 2 days or a week old. Anyway, it was a good book. So I also read a book. This is the third time I've read it, and this is a book that Steve Donahue turned me onto, called The Uncommon Reader. It's written by Alan Bennett, and I'll give a brief overview. It's very short. You can finish it in 3 hours easily, even if you're an average speed reader. But it was written while the Queen of England was still alive, and she develops a reading habit. And this turns out to not be a very popular thing for her to do with her staff or her husband or anyone else involved in the British government. They don't like it that she's becoming well-read. And all she wants to do is talk about books now. What that leads to eventually, I'm not going to get into too much, but it's just a wonderful little novel. It's the kind of book that people who love books and reading books about books is really going to love. You know what? I'm putting a little lip balm on now. It's important, to me anyway, keep my lips soft and supple, because you never know when some smooching action might break out, even for poor old Randy Ray. But I do have a copy of the cover. It's 120 pages long, The Uncommon Reader. And here's the cover art, which I think is really lovely. But it's got a very dry sense of humor, and it's really cute how she accidentally becomes such an avid reader. And what that leads her to is also really interesting. So I also got on a little bit of a self-help kick. And I'm reading 100 self-help books right now, so you don't have to. So I'm going to have this really long self-help book video coming out next year sometime. And one of the approaches I like to take to self-help is not necessarily to read self-help books, but to read biographies. I love biographies about people who have traits that I would like to develop. And I like to learn more about what traits they have and why I admire them so much. So I started these biographies this month with The Snowball, Warren Buffett and the Business of Life, which is a very long book because he's a really old guy. And, the cover art, this is not what the cover of the book actually looks like in real life. But anyway, it was written by Alice Schroeder. Terrific book if you're interested in Warren Buffett. Now, if you have no interest in Warren Buffett and how and why he was so successful in the stock market, you probably won't like The Snowball. But it was terrific. Moving on to someone else I admire, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. This is one of several books by Jimmy Carter, about Jimmy Carter, that I read last month. But this is 782 pages long, so it was a pretty detailed biography that covered both his career in the White House and in politics and his career after the White House. And the traditional wisdom about Jimmy Carter is, oh man, he's such a great ex-president. If only he hadn't been such a lousy president. But as this book points out, and multiple other books, if you do get any education about Jimmy Carter yourself, you'll find that he actually was a very successful president. Most of the stuff that he wanted to get done on his agenda, he got done. One of the big misses, he was not able to get health care reform passed. We had to wait for Obama. And a big part of the problem with him not able to get health care passed was Ted Kennedy. You can learn more about that and his other experiences in the White House in this detailed biography, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, written by Jonathan Alter. Oh, it was a terrific book. I think he's a fascinating individual. And there's much to admire about how he lives his life and how he managed his political career. I met Jimmy Carter once in the 1990s at a book signing. I waited in line for 4 hours in the freezing cold to finally get in there to get him to sign my book. And I don't remember what book it was now. I'm sure it's around here somewhere. But I read multiple books by Jimmy Carter. An Hour Before Daylight, Memories of a Rural Boyhood. A Full Life, Reflections at 90. And Christmas in Plains, Memories. I read all three of those. A lot of the content in those three books overlap. A Full Life, Reflections at 90, I thought was going to have more to do with the process of aging and what his life was like at 90. But it basically covered, a lot of the same stuff as An Hour Before Daylight, Memories of a Rural Boyhood. There was a lot of overlap there because, reflecting back on his life as a boy growing up in Georgia, important thing for Jimmy Carter. Christmas in Plains, Memories, actually stood out a little bit more because you've got a little bit more to talk about because you've narrowed the focus there to the Christmas stuff. And I don't know that I have the cover art for any of these on here because I think I borrowed all of them. Yeah, I borrowed every one of those through Kindle Unlimited, so I don't have the cover art to show on them. I used to have hardcover copies of them. My dad was a big Jimmy Carter fan, and so I bought him copies of most of these as gifts for Christmas at some point in the distant past. While I was in the rehab hospital, I did meet with a therapist, this kind of therapist. And we were discussing the biographies that I'd been reading and how much I was enjoying them. And she suggested that I find a biography of Joseph Pilates. She's a Pilates instructor. This counselor that I had, amazing woman, okay? So she's got her MBA because she wants to know how to make money. She's got a bachelor's degree she's got her master's of social work, so she's able to do accounting. She's got her bachelor's degree in exercise sciences, and I think in nutrition sciences as well. And she's a Pilates instructor. So I found a book called Caged Lion, Joseph Pilates and His Legacy. I didn't know anything about Pilates. I know it's a workout plan. That's it. That's all I know. So this book was written by an attorney who's about 80 years old now. But in the 60s, when Joseph Pilates was inventing his exercise program and had a small gym in New York City, Joseph Pilates was 80 years old at the time. So this attorney was there for the beginning of Pilates and saw how it opened. And Joseph Pilates, of course, died before his wife. And so she didn't know anything about running the business. So this attorney who wrote this biography at the time in the 60s when Joe Pilates died, got together with a bunch of the other customers at the gym where they worked out to put together a company that would continue to run the gym with varying degrees of success so that she would have money to make it through to the end of her life. So it's a really fascinating book. Joseph Pilates is quite a bit of a mystery in the book. And he doesn't get into a whole lot of detail about how the workout plan works. But if you go to a Pilates studio anywhere in the country, you're learning from someone who learned Pilates from someone else who probably learned it from Joseph Pilates. There's probably only 2 or 3 generations difference there. But everyone who learned the Pilates workout plan from Joseph Pilates made some changes to it and made it their own. But at the end of the day, he used machines that he had invented. Anyway, it was a really fascinating book about a character that I knew absolutely nothing about. But I can tell you this, when I'm well enough, I am definitely going to try Pilates. I understand it's something that, much like yoga, can be adjusted based on your level of fitness. And as you're probably aware, my level of fitness isn't very good. In fact, I've lost 168 pounds this year, and I still have quite a bit of weight to lose. But I'm not going to sneeze at the 168 pounds that I've lost either. That's been really good. But one of the reasons that I've been hospitalized so much is that I keep falling down. So 3 hours of physical therapy a day for 2 weeks made a huge difference in terms of my ability just to stay out of the floor. I don't want to fall and hit my head. A friend of mine fell and hit his head just last weekend, and he was unconscious for 30 hours before they found him. He almost died. Bad news. Don't want that to be my story. So, Superbetter, a revolutionary approach to getting stronger, happier, braver, and more resilient, powered by the science of games. That's a title right there, isn't it? That's a hell of a title. This was written by Jane Mcgonigal, who has, this is a Penguin book. This is the cover right here. I've had this book for years and never read it. It was a New York Times bestseller, grounded in scientific research, based on the experiences of over 500,000 people. Superbetter, The Power of Living Gainfully, so it has a different subtitle on the cover, is at heart a simple and transformative idea. We can use the same psychological strengths we display when we play games to confront real-life challenges, from trauma and illness to just changing our habits for the better. Well, if there was a book that I needed, this was it, right? Because I was in the hospital because of chronic illnesses, and I need that type of resilience. So this was the right book at the right time for the right person. Jane Mcgonigal is a PhD and a game designer who got a concussion, and I believe she just slammed her head into a cabinet door. It was just an everyday kind of accident. But some concussions, like some cases of COVID, develop into long-term symptoms, and this is what happened with her. And so she was told that basically the only thing she could do to speed her recovery, was to avoid any of the things that made her symptoms worse, which means she couldn't watch television. She couldn't play video games. She couldn't read books. In other words, all the things that make life worth living for her, she could not do. That's how she put it. And so she had to figure out, and she also started having suicidal ideations because that's a typical side effect of a long-term concussion symptoms. So she realized that and I think it might have been her boyfriend who told her this, but she needed to put her skills as a game designer to work to get through this, because basically she had to just wait it out. And waiting it out's not her strong suit. So, one of the tools that she uses was to create a secret identity for herself. And so she became Jane the Concussion Slayer. And I played the game. I played along with it in the book, and I'm working through the app with it too. But my secret identity, for those Star Trek fans out there, is Admiral Randy Tiberius. Those of you who aren't Star Trek fans probably don't care, but James T. Kirk stands for James Tiberius Kirk. And I even have a bottle of Tiberius cologne in my bedroom. It's Star Trek themed cologne. I've showed it off in a video here before. I used to keep it on my desk as a knickknack. It's gold and got the little Star Trek emblem on it, but I digress. But anyway, so she's got multiple things in this book about going on quests, finding allies, finding power-ups, things that make you feel better even when you don't expect to be able to feel better, and enemies to overcome. And you can create your own of all these things and set up a plan where you can still achieve your goals even though you're chronically ill and don't feel good. And what it reminded me of, I have a dear friend named Christy, and we became friends when we were both sick at the same time in the same hospital. We knew each other from a bunch of mutual friends already, but she didn't like me very much at the time. But she warmed up to me when we were both ill at the same time. But she had a heart attack, 51 years old, I think. 50, 49 maybe, I don't know. She had a heart attack, and she had not read Superbetter, and still hasn't read Superbetter. I talked to her about it over the weekend. But one of the things that she did was she set some really tall goals for herself. Jane Mcgonigal would call these, in terms of the Superbetter game, epic wins. And so she set a goal to become a vegan. And, there's a lot of scientific evidence that's pretty convincing that a vegan diet will help you with your heart problems, and can even, if Dean Ornish is to be believed, you can reverse heart disease. But other doctors say that's a little bit too strong a claim based on the science. I don't know. But she became a vegan, and a year later she ran a marathon. This is a woman who had a heart attack, running a marathon a year later. So I sometimes wish I could have just stayed at the rehab hospital, because they did so much with me in just 2 weeks that if they had me for another 50 weeks, I don't doubt I could probably run an ultra marathon. Because let me tell you, when I went into the hospital, I was not allowed to go from the bed to the chair. I was using a bedpan. They didn't trust me to go to the bathroom because a fall was just that likely. Okay. So for me to be able to walk, and I'm using a walker these days too, or a rollator, they call it. But yeah, I use a walker to keep my balance, and I got a new one last week. But I was able to walk 170 feet without the walker at the end of my 2 weeks of physical therapy. Now I had to stop and take breaks. Okay, I didn't walk 170 feet straight and then stop. I walked 20 feet, sat down and rested, 20 feet, sat down and rested, 40 feet, sat down and rested, etc. until I hit 170 feet. But for me to be able to do that after just 2 weeks of being in a position where I literally couldn't get up and go to the bathroom, unbelievable. They've made a believer out of me in terms of physical therapy. And so I'm still trying to decide. Well, I actually have an epic win planned. What I want is for a year from now, in November 1st of next year, 2025, I want to be going for a 1 hour walk every morning, 6 days a week. Sunday's a day of rest. But I want to be going for an hour long walk in the park 6 days a week, every week, because I'm getting older. And that's the kind of exercise that I need to be doing, is low impact exercise. And I need to stay healthy. It's really important, because even though my cancer is in remission right now, I haven't been cured and won't be cured unless they find a cure for this particular cancer, which they haven't done yet. So anyway, Superbetter was really good. I was really impressed with it. Definitely 4 stars. And so I mentioned also earlier that there was a book that, I don't know if I brought my copy of that in here with me. I think I did. Hold on a second there. Don't go away, folks. So we read on how the Great Gatsby came to be and why it endures. Okay, so this is a book that's about twice as long as the Great Gatsby itself, written by Maureen Corrigan, who is the book critic for National Public Radio, NPR. She's terrific. Terrific. If you've ever listened to her on Fresh Air, she's absolutely amazing. But also, she's a really talented writer. And The Great Gatsby is her favorite book, and she goes on and on about it at great length. And she's the one who pointed out how intricately designed this particular novel is, and points out the themes and the symbolism that she's picked up on through the years of reading and rereading and reading and rereading this book. So the other F. Scott Fitzgerald novel that I've read, I did not like very much. It was his first novel. I don't remember the title of it off the top of my head. I guess I could look it up right quick. But anyway, I didn't care for it at all. And I haven't read his other ones yet, but I plan to. This Side of Paradise was his first novel. And I didn't care for it at all. It's not something I'll ever return to for a reread. The nicest thing I can say about it is it's not a very long novel. He only wrote 5 or 6 novels, but he wrote over 160 short stories. 160 short stories is a tremendous body of work. And at the time when he was writing, people paid for short fiction. Saturday Evening Post was paying him $3,000, $4,000 a story. That was in 1920s money, man. Can you believe that? You can't get $3,000 for a short story today. Unless you're Stephen King, maybe, and you're finding the right market for it. I don't know. But yeah. And the guy was still broke all the time. I'm sure me and F. Scott Fitzgerald would have gone along great, because I'm always broke too. I also read It's Been a Good Life, which I gave 3 stars. This is one of 4 autobiographies of Isaac Asimov. And this was the 4th and final one, I believe. And it was okay. Asimov wrote very clearly in his nonfiction, and his science fiction was pretty good too. Although, his characters are just, he's from that old school science fiction era that Arthur C. Clarke is from too, where these are novels of ideas and concepts. They're not really about people. So the characters in them, aren't particularly deep or particularly interesting or anything like that. Robert Heinlein was the other author in the big 3, and you cannot claim that Robert Heinlein did not draw interesting characters, because his characters were interesting, sometimes freakishly so. A lot of times there's a character who stands in for Robert Heinlein in all those books. It's really funny. And then finally, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream was the other biography that I read. And Lyndon Johnson, of course, I told you I was reading books by people who I admired. But that didn't mean that they're not necessarily flawed characters. Lyndon Johnson obviously was very flawed. This book was written by, she's a famous historian, Doris Kearns, I think. I'm looking it up right now. I should have been more prepared. I apologize. Lyndon Johnson, and what's the subtitle? And the American Dream. This was the first book she ever wrote, and she actually served in his administration in a minor role for part of the time. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote this book, and you can tell it's her first book. It was not especially good. But if you're interested in Lyndon Johnson and tales of how, he used his power in the Senate, and you don't want to read Robert Caro's monstrous books on the subject, because he's written 3 and he's got one more coming. Each volume is over 1,000 pages. This particular book might have been 300 pages long. So, it skates over a lot of detail that it could have included. But yeah, from 1976, it was her first book, and it shows. So, those are the 16 books that I read in October of 2024. I haven't done a lot of monthly recaps because I've been in and out of the hospital all year. So I may go back and make some more monthly recap videos. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing what else I read this year. I've read 107 books so far this year. This is the biggest reading year I've had in well over 10, 15 years. But in large part, that's because, I just haven't been able to do much else besides read. So, also, what'd you read in October? Did you like it, love it, hate it? Let me know in the comments, or make your own video and tell me about your video in the comments. I usually close these videos. It's been a while since I've made a video, but I usually close these videos by reminding you to stay hydrated, which is more important to me now than ever because it's put me in the hospital multiple times. But also, stay sexy, folks. I'll see you in the next video.